It is not often in my work in the history of anti-Semitism that I have the opportunity to talk about someone I admire, especially among active players in the history of anti-Semitism during the Hitler years. In the case of James Parks, however, it is a pleasure and an honor to do so, for this is a man who, in all of his humanness, has given us an unsurpassed legacy of pioneering efforts that eventually led to the post-Holocaust reversal of 1900 years of negative Christian teachings on Jews. In this historiographic sense, Parks' legacy is rich in attributions by scholars in North America, Israel, Britain, and continental Europe. He is hailed as the great Christian pioneer in the study and combating of anti-Semitism, the pioneer purveyor of scholarly evidence that links traditional Christian teachings on Jews to the development of modern anti-Semitism, the pioneering dissenter on Christian missions to Jews, and the pioneering insister on the perdurability of God's covenant with Jews. As framed recently in a widely acclaimed book on the Catholic theologians who carved the post-Holocaust path to the Vatican II proclamation, reversing 2,000 years of teaching on the deicidental guilt of Jews, James Parks stood alone in his rejection of the traditional anti-Jewish components of Christian theology during the Hitler years. John Connolly, the author's quote, "With the exception of Parks, no Christian theologian of note dissented from this point of view before 1945. Not Charles Journet, Jacques Maritain, Karl Barth, Martin Niemöller, or even the martyrs Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Bernard Lichtenberg." For those engaged in this historiography of the post-Holocaust transformation of official Christian teachings on Jews, as these attributions hopefully make clear, it is utterly impossible not to begin with the pioneering arguments and work of James Parks. For those who are not immersed in this field, however, the name of James Parks as a defender of Jews and Judaism during the Hitler years has not received the recognition it deserves. I would like to suggest that this is not only a tragic dishonor to Parks' work on behalf of Jews in the darkest of times, but also to a world today that is sorely in need of Parks' humanitarian vision of equality and justice, which I will try to attempt to sketch tonight. One of the historiographic points typically cited about Parks is that his research in the history of anti-Semitism first began when he was working for the International Student Service in Europe, and that within the span of a few years, he produced two classic studies that linked Christian teachings on Jews to modern anti-Semitism. What is not discussed, nor indeed recognized, is that the work of Parks the scholar was forged in the fires of an intense activism that involved physical, mental, and emotional strain, as well as exposure to danger. When 32-year-old Parks assumed his role as Secretary for International Cultural Cooperation in 1928, the greatest challenge in European universities was mounting nationalist aggressions toward Jewish minorities in post-World War I Eastern European nations. The Nazi Party had already founded the National Socialist Student League in Germany for the purpose of integrating universities with Nazi ideology. The leader of the anti-Semitic party in Romania was an esteemed university professor. Anti-Jewish violence in universities was a regular occurrence, and the combined effects of numerous clauses in Eastern European nations, both by law and de facto, had driven as many as 10,000 Eastern European Jewish students to expatriation in search of university enrollment. Given these circumstances, all of Parks' work on Jewish matters with the International Student Service between 1928 and 1934 was refugee-related, for it dealt directly with the increasing anti-Semitic nationalism that was creating Jewish immigrants who were fleeing anti-Semitic violence and denial of university education. The program that Parks created to mitigate the violence was both innovative and daring. He developed a series of international conferences and study groups that brought Jewish and non-Jewish nationalist students face-to-face at a mediated table of equality and justice. As part of this initiative, Parks was directly involved with students caught in the web of escalating anti-Semitism, not only by bringing them together for mediated discussion, but also by traveling extensively to all of the European countries affected by anti-Jewish nationalist aggressions. After the first conference outside of Paris in late 1928, he was also placed in the path of the Nazi Party, for Nationalist Socialist students insisted on the grounds of ISS neutrality that their spokesman be granted equal hearing at the conferences. The resulting ISS promise of impartiality meant that Parks, by 1931, was speaking from the same podium as National Socialist defenders of anti-Semitism, such as Dr. Wilhelm Stapel, a Protestant editor of a German anti-Semitic journal who became advisor to Hitler's Reich Minister of Church Affairs in 1935. What is most striking here is that even under these conditions, Parks' mediation continued to lead students toward agreements that anti-Semitic denigration and violence was absolutely unacceptable. This and the fact that Parks' name appeared widely as a dedicated defender of Jewish students in continental British and North American newspapers also led to growing irritation with Parks in Germany. The irritation on Parks' part was clearly reciprocal by 1932, when university violence increased not only in Eastern Europe, but also in Germany, where National Socialist students demanded expulsion of all Jewish students. In a very strong response, Parks published a scathing editorial in the December 1932 issue of the tri-language ISS Journal, signaling out adult leaders of the National Socialists in Germany, the National Democrats in Poland, and the Iron Guard in Romania as the ultimate cause of the student violence. While holding responsible the students who directly perpetrated the violence, Parks stressed that the ultimate blame fell on those who were using their influence to incite the students, and in so doing, he charged nationalist leaders with intentionally using and abusing university students to advance anti-Semitic nationalist goals. The backlash in Germany played out swiftly in a series of bold and harsh actions. Parks was publicly taken to task in a widely publicized essay by National Socialist students soon after Hitler rose to power in January 1933. Shortly thereafter, the July ISS conference in Bavaria that had been scheduled far in advance of Hitler's rise, which Parks subsequently refused to attend, was attended by Heinrich Himmler and Ernst Röhm. 1 year later, almost to the day, the ISS assemblyman who had organized the Bavarian conference was taken from his Munich flat and brutally murdered. The following spring, after ISS had suspended all relations with Nazi Germany and Parks was preparing to move from Geneva to England, his flat was, quote, protectively occupied by police upon learning that Parks had been targeted by the Swiss Nazis. 2 weeks hence, a male employee assisting with the move to England was mistaken for Parks and seriously injured in an attempted murder that resulted in a lingering concussion and long-term impairments. The failed murder was widely reported by Reuters, with stories about Parks' threatening work on anti-Semitism and the protocols of Zion reaching as far as the front page of the English newspaper in Buenos Aires. Parks' efforts on behalf of Jewish victims of anti-Semitism in this same period is also clear in his May 1933 appointment as head of an autonomous committee charged with the development of an ISS program for student refugee relief. While Parks was in Canada raising funds for that relief program later that fall, the League of Nations appointed American James McDonnell as High Commissioner for Refugees from Germany, and on the same day, Parks was recommended as his non-Jewish expert. As part of McDonnell's initial traveling staff, Parks sailed from New York in early November, meeting regularly during the passage, and then accompanying McDonnell to the first informal High Commission meetings in Paris. While Parks' association with McDonnell did not result in his acceptance of a permanent position, the committee that Parks headed for ISS was officially named as the responsible refugee student arm of the High Commission. And by March 1934, some 1,325 Jewish immigrant students had benefited from the program that Parks created and orchestrated. After relocating in England in 1935, Parks' home in Barley, near Cambridge, which was right down the road from his church, became an open-door refuge for countless others who were fleeing Hitler's advancing aggressions. Parks' home in Barley was also a place of simultaneous scholarly production, which turns this period into an open window on the ways in which his humanitarian concern for individuals was sewn into the everyday fabric of his scholarly and activist life. Parks' involvements with organizations on behalf of refugees, such as the Church of England Committee for Non-Aryan Christians in Germany and the Christian Council for Refugees from Germany and Central Europe, were intermingled with his involvements with the Foreign Department of Chatham House, the Political and Economic Policy Institute, the Board of Deputies of British Jews, the British section of the World Jewish Congress, the Joint Foreign Committee on Jewish Reconstruction, as well as British Zionists. And all of this was intertwined with his ongoing research into the origins and causes of anti-Semitism. I find it especially informing, and I hope that you will also, that amidst all of this rigorous activity, Parks' prolific scholarship proceeded throughout the years of war without even a hint that while he was publishing, consulting, and speaking in an endless cycle, he was also trying to figure out what could be sold from his garden and what could be kept to feed his household of refugees and evacuees, which averaged from 5 to 7 at any time. As example of how all of this fit together, in late August 1938, Parks accepted an urgent appeal for 3 weeks of lectures and national broadcasts on anti-Semitism and refugees through the University of Toronto for early November. As soon as a Canadian invitation was accepted, additional lectures began to be scheduled in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and the New York metropolitan area by the New York-based League for Fair Play. Before departing for Canada, Parks fulfilled a privately scheduled event at Chatham House in late October, which included such influential discussions as Anthony de Rothschild, Sir Niall Malcolm, Sir John Hope Simpson, Sir Edward Paycock, Sir Frederick Paidler. Parks' increasing concern about the reluctance of nations to open their doors to Jews led him to argue before this group for the immense importance of a national Jewish home in Palestine, and to do so against the repeated protests of Sir Niall Malcolm that what happened in Palestine was comparatively unimportant. Parks also argued for organizations of Jews and Christians who could stand as a united collaborative front on behalf of the increasing refugee population. Warning this group of influential discussants that the refugee problem would only get worse, Parks urged presciently that we must be prepared to see an immense tragedy overtake the Jews. 2 weeks later, as Parks began his series of lectures and broadcasts in Toronto, the Kristallnacht pogrom of Nazi violence in Germany and Austria erupted on the 9th of November, and Parks was asked to extend his stay in order to aid and advise on the formation of a National Canadian Refugee Committee. Arriving in New York the second week in December, to deliver the rest of his scheduled lectures, he spent the first open morning, 8 days later, at the National Coordinating Committee for German Refugees, wading through the process of refugee entry into the United States on behalf of Alexander Teague, a former Viennese associate from the World Union of Jewish Students and the future grandfather of British actress Rachel Weisz. Parks had begun the process of securing British entry and work for Teague immediately after Hitler's annexation of Austria in March 1938, and his efforts on behalf of him spread wherever he went. During Parks' lectures and consultations in Toronto, he had circulated his CV in search of Canadian sponsors, and once reaching New York, he had started the entry process there as well, based on the hope that it might increase the possibility of a future open door. By early January 1939, Teague had been granted entry to Britain and was living with Parks at Barley. His Catholic wife and daughter were also there before the outbreak of war. The three of them lived with Parks through the end of the year, during which time Parks gained a place for their daughter in a Cambridge Catholic school. By the end of that year, he also had Teague's wife on her way to speaking, writing, and typing well enough in English to qualify for secretarial work should it become available. The family remained with Parks until he was able to settle them in a small cottage at Barley in January 1940, where they lived for the duration of the war. Parks' never-ceasing concern about national doors being closed to Jews was in many ways matched by his concern about how Jews were treated once they were allowed into a nation. In no instance does this become more transparent than when he learned in spring of 1939 that numbers of Jewish Kindertransport children had been given refuge by a Christian mission to Jews that required parental consent for them to be raised as Christians. Parks was morally outraged that the saving of children should be conditioned on anything at all, let alone a conversionary pressure that took advantage of Jewish parents who were desperate to find a place of safety for their children. Parks used his car, his resources, and his time over the course of the next 3 months to assist Jewish leaders in locating and relocating wherever possible some 28 young Jewish boys, and he followed up periodically in some of his many activist publications with an ongoing critique of the bystanding churches who never repudiated what Parks called this Christian kidnapping of Jewish children. When war erupted in the fall of 1939, Parks was deeply concerned about what he should do, how he should do it, and how and where to distribute his efforts and time. During his long reflections in those early months, he recognized that the only way Jews would have any chance in the post-World War world was in the saving of democratic civilization, and that every battle on every issue of Jewish importance, whether local, regional, or national, was in that way an international battle. The battle on the home front, wherever it erupted, was thus for Parks inherently tied to the battle for a democratic civilization in which Jews could live safely as Jews. One of his main preoccupations in this national-international sense was what he deemed the audacity of conversionary policies on Jews, and it ran the entire course of his work, dating back to the publication of his first book on anti-Semitism in 1930 and dating forward to the end of his life in 1981. I hope that I did that. In Parks' earliest research into the causes of anti-Semitism in European universities, his one presupposition that was more firmly established by each piece of historical evidence he acquired was that both the roots and the cure for anti-Semitism lay in human history and not in any supernatural explanation. He thus dismissed out of hand any theory that attributed anti-Semitic cause to Jews as a people set apart and hostile to the rest of humanity, or to the direct action of God in the condemnation of the alleged deicide race. Each of these theories, he argued, whether espoused by anti-Semites or Christians, resulted in explanations that focused on Jewish actions and behaviors that self-caused their own misfortune and hatred by others. In addition to anti-Semitism having no roots in the supernatural, Parks also insisted, contrary to emerging, contrary to emerging conversionist claims, that no solution was to be found there either, for anti-Semitism and the Jewish problem could only be unraveled by human intelligence and resolved by human action. As it turned out, Parks' book was published in 1930 at precisely the same time that the International Missionary Council was launching a mandated initiative for world expansion of Jewish missions. Parks' arguments undermine the claims of this initiative in critical ways, most basically in its claim that anti-Semitism and the Jewish problem could only be solved by bringing Jews to their divine destiny through Christianization. The first complaints and criticism about Parks' book from ecumenical Protestant leaders poured in shortly after its publication, marking the first in a long and unbroken line of attempts to educate Parks on his mistaken views. The book was deemed to be uninformed, in great error, shooting off like a loose cannon, and damaging to his future work and career. Parks' response, which also marked the first in a long and unbroken line, was to ignore the criticisms and focus instead on the abyss of differences between the work he was trying to do and that of the ecumenical Protestant missionizing initiative. Beginning at this point in 1930 and throughout the rest of his life, Parks contended that undoing the damage of historical Christian attitudes toward Jews demanded that Christians allow Jews to exist as Jews. He insisted that the key to improve Christian-Jewish relations was equality. But that could never be achieved so long as Christianity believed it possessed something that Judaism lacked. Parks denied unequivocally that Judaism had lost divine authority, that Jews had been placed under a curse for the crime of deicide, and that Christianity was the fulfillment of Judaism. He refuted all ideas of Jewish missions, all attempts to standardize theological justification for evangelization of Jews, and all tactics aimed at universal adoption of official conversionary policy. He argued from start to finish that it was impossible to improve Christian relations with Jews until Christianity began the process of acknowledging and repudiating some 1900 years of unjust oppression and false representation of Jews in Judaism, including the idea that it was God's desire for Jews to become Christians. And he unequivocally refuted all notions that Christianity was the completion of Judaism by arguing that both religions were a developmental part of one essential truth, and that historical Christian attempts at Jewish conversion had failed and would continue to fail because it was not God's will that the truth of Judaism should be abandoned. It is perhaps important to just pause here for a second in recognition of the simultaneousness of issues and their rapid unfolding as the war progressed into 1942 and 1943, in order for us to realize that Parks was waging this lone battle at the same time that he was doing all that could be done to convince Britain to rescue as many victims of Nazi extermination as possible. As Parks simultaneously went on to urge Christian leaders to look at the injustice of Christian attitudes, doctrines, and beliefs about Jews over the remainder of the war, he was the recipient of attacks ranging from overly emotional about the dangers of anti-Semitism to unbalanced and dangerous influence. Moreover, and perhaps more painfully, Reverend Dr. James Parks was also tried and judged on a regular basis as unchristian. Instead of being pressured into acquiescence and silence by degradations that would have bludgeoned a lesser human, Parks learned how to harvest the criticism of his Christian critics and use them to hone stronger repudiating arguments with finer points of elaboration. Indeed, arguments that had been honed under the fires of harsh criticism during the years of war were used to make a bold approach to the World Council of Churches shortly before its historic founding assembly in 1948. When Parks learned in March of that year that an official Jewish mission policy would be formulated and passed at this founding assembly, he wrote to the head of the commission asking for opportunity to present an alternate position. By way of undaunted persistence, he was able to gain a seat on one of the two commissions involved with the founding statement on Jews, but a mere 2 weeks later, that place was rescinded by, quote, an official ruling at another level, and Parks was denied even visitor status to the assembly. The formal statement that was debated and drafted in Parks' absence at the founding assembly of the World Council of Churches lamented the extermination of 6 million Jews while pointing to the continued existence of a Jewish people who does not acknowledge Christ. Every sentence of the 1,565-word statement received by the electorate of a 1,200-person assembly of 147 churches from 44 countries was unequivocal in its conviction that God's design for Jews was acquiescence to Christianity, and there was no hint whatsoever that Jewish existence had any significance other than, quote, the special meaning of the Jewish people for the Christian faith. As such, every aspect of this post-Holocaust Protestant profession was hinged on belief in a Christian responsibility to evangelize Jews, and not, as James Parks had been arguing since 1930, on the Christian responsibility of allowing Jews to exist as Jews while making the world safe for them to do so. It was not until 1982, the year after James Parks' death, that the World Council of Churches formally moved from this position. To try and gather up all of these assorted pieces and bring this brief glimpse of James Parks to a close, I would like for us to go back in time to the fall of 1934 and the publication of Park's classic study on the origins of anti-Semitism, where he argued from a mass of primary sources that the conceptual portrait of Jews drawn in the first 3 centuries by church fathers laid the foundation on which a superstructure of anti-Jewish theology, religious coercion, and legalized oppression sustained through the centuries, making the claims of modern anti-Semitism credible. Immediately after the publication of this second groundbreaking study that linked Christian teachings on Jews to the development of modern anti-Semitism, Claude Montefiore asked of Parks a question that could easily be applied to any stage of his pioneering work. How did you do it? How could you have read all that terrific amount, written all that, and thought all that, and done all kinds of other things too? I would like to suggest that one answer to Montefiore's question in 1934, or indeed at any part in Park's life work thereafter, was that the personal cost of forging his pioneering work was exceedingly great, but that Parks viewed such cost as an ultimately fair exchange in his pursuit for a moral life that recognized and respected an inclusive humanity of all peoples, nations, races, and faiths. While this is not to draw a hagiographic halo on a man who was so obviously human in his limitations, frailties, and faults, it is to say that his understanding of cost and purpose in a human system of equality and justice is as true today as it was in the Hitler years. In the historiographically acclaimed book that I mentioned earlier, the beginning of the talk, on the overturning of Jewish deocidal guilt at Vatican II in 1965, historian John Connolly, after citing Parks as the only theologian who dissented from traditional Christian teachings on Jews during the Hitler years, Connolly goes on to say that those same theologians who did not dissent from harmful teaching on Jews learned to draw on Parks' humanity in the post-Holocaust decades. Indeed, Parks, the pioneering dissenter, the pioneering insister, and the pioneering purveyor of scholarly evidence that links traditional Christian teachings on Jews to the development of anti-Semitism, stands at the head of a very long line of post-Holocaust theologians who have followed in his path. What they gradually learned from Parks was how to draw on a humanitarianism that was not overridden by a system of beliefs that superseded or limited the humanity of others regardless of faith, race, ethnic, or national origins. And this, I think, and I think James Parks would agree, is as valid today as it was in the years that he stood on those principles alone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, for such an important and relevant talk. And I think we have some time for questions now. So, yeah, please.
That's wonderful. That fires me up hugely.
Good.
Brilliant. I'm interested in two things, actually. Where did James Parks get that passion from to begin with? Can you say more about that? And also, what significant Protestant theologians objected to Parks' arguments when he was making them, especially after the Holocaust had become clear? Were there any that disputed?
Of course, the Archbishop of Canterbury would be one, and by 1942, Parks was arguing vigorously. I mean, he actually referred to it as his showdown period. He was intensely involved in attempting the blocking of this conversionary program that was spreading so rapidly that it was attempting to undermine the founding organization of the British Council of Christians and Jews. And so at that point in 1942, just a couple months before we actually had the information, when the United Nations signed that very important declaration in December of 1942, it was just shortly before that, but there was already an incredible amount of information out. Parks actually started with the Archbishop of Canterbury and worked his way down in terms of attempting to block this. And in every situation, he had some very kind rebuffings. But
that was William Temple.
Yes, but and Temple was very, very kind, and he liked Parks. He liked him very, very much, but he completely disagreed. His answer to this was basically he stated he's also very interested and concerned about the Jews, but if he has to make a choice, he will choose the Christian theology that says Jews have to be that they need to be converted. So he went to the secretary, went to all of the leaders of the main ecumenical Protestant organizations, the International Missionary Council. He had already been in touch with. This is one of the reasons that he didn't quite make it after he was able to slip in under the door and get that seat in the 1948 commission. It only lasted for 2 weeks. They knew him, and as soon as his name came to the higher ups, it was a finished deal for him. He couldn't get there. So there were many, and I would be very happy to give you. The list is huge, and I think if you just go back to what John Connolly said, Parks stood alone in this. He was basically the only one, and he was really fighting a single battle on this front. Is that helpful?
Well, it does. I'm slightly confused though still, if I may,
Please.
because there would be plenty of people, including Temple, who would have had a very strong view of human equality on all sorts of intersections of race and ethnic class and all that, and would have stood very strongly against anti-Semitism.
Oh, of course, yes.
But you're distinguishing that from the conversionist.
Oh,
program.
absolutely. Oh, absolutely. And of course, Temple. Of course, he was against anti-Semitism, and he was, of course, for equality. But the thing that's so remarkable, and I will come back. I will say again that Parks' humanitarianism was one that was not overridden by a system of beliefs, and the answers that were being given by people like William Temple and William Patton and a host of other very important figures had nothing to do with equality. They didn't even see this as a conversion was not a matter of equality. It was a matter of divine doctrine. And so that they wanted equality, but equality within limits, and it certainly had nothing to do with Christian doctrine.
There was another question over here before. So you can.
This is sort of inappropriate for Interfaith Week, but wouldn't Parks have been better just abandoning the religious aspect and just worked in human rights groups? He had, on this is partly Colin Richmond's view, and it's maybe not fair to Parks, but he had two big opportunities where he could have worked with MacDonald and the League of Nations High Commission. He was offered a peerage to work as a sort of almost the equivalent of Eleanor Rathbone in Lords as the sort of fighter for the Jewish cause, and that he was never going to get very far particularly in his own, even in the liberal Anglican movement, and that he should have just sort of, because he was president of Commonwealth, the most progressive political party that Britain's ever seen, formed in the Second World War for New Britain, which Boris Johnson will fulfil in the next few weeks, of course. But an incredible organisation, and it was right that he should be president. So he had this very large presence in the secular world. And Julia just said, look, I'm not going to get anywhere. It's a world that's not being particularly progressive, and just become a secular figure with his own religious beliefs.
Thank you. I guess my first answer has to be that as this person wouldn't have considered this as a reasonable question, and he wouldn't have considered it as reasonable because everything else was ancillary. Everything else that he did, I mean, for whatever involvements that he had, it was ancillary to his quest for a moral foundation, and he was very. I don't want to get too sentimental and say things that sound kind of too watery, but he was a real believer in his faith. He just saw it as extremely flawed. He had a very, very, very deep and beautiful, from everything that I can surmise, relationship with the God that he knew. And when he was so troubled at the outbreak of war and was reflecting and thinking, his letters are so deeply touching that he says, I really don't know where I can be of help. And he was doing all of these things already, but he's saying, where can I be of help? Where can I do it? And he would go through some of this, and then he would say, I know, I don't know what it's going to be, but I know that it's going to have something to do with the moral backgrounds of this mess. And I think that when I read some of his John Hedham books, it's amazing the understanding that he has about the God that he is trying to write about, and this God that he knows and understands is a God of hope. So I think it's a very valid and fascinating question. I just can't see that he would have entertained it, and I think that this is at the bottom of his refusal of all those other things that could have made him a very, very well-known person.
Any other questions? Yes, Claire.
So, just to continue on that, so he seemed to be really isolated and very alone. So does it mean that he never found any support inside or outside, or that he did not seek? Was he really isolated? Or?
No, I really don't think he was. I think he was very isolated in terms of being on this battlefront against Christian beliefs and doctrines during that period of time. No, I think he had lots and lots of support. And as a matter of fact, one of the things that I sort of disagree with in terms of his biographers is that aspect. He stood alone on his principles. There's absolutely no question about that. But his letters to friends that were close to him and he had known for many, many years are really special. I mean, they're just lovely, and they're very revealing of things that we wouldn't know about him other than that. And I certainly can't see that he was isolated. He was on the go constantly. He was involved in everything in 100 different places all at the same time. And, he was people were just after him all the time. His popularity with Jews was great. He was just a dissenting, I use this just with quotes around, enemy of the Protestant Christian establishment that wanted to push this conversionary agenda. And it was a very big program to be worldwide, and it's quite impressive. So he was really, when he was, and this is one of the points that I would like to draw here. when he was fighting against the conversionary issues right here in Britain and the problems of this group trying to undermine the founding of the British Council of Christians and Jews, he knew all the time that this was an international battle. And what he was doing made a huge difference internationally. And as soon as the war was over, the elements of this group from America that could start traveling back and forth again were actually even more united against him. He was just there. If there could be a number one conversionary enemy, he was it for this whole group. So, but in terms of him actually being alone, I don't think so. And I think the other thing, I think he was a very happy person. In addition to all this, which is very hard for me to understand, I would be crying all the time. But
I'd like to ask
yes.
About, did you write or talk about the idea of missions or missionaries for non-Jews, or was he only concerned with the question of Jews?
No, he didn't. No, he didn't have a problem. Well, he wasn't really involved in that. No, his concern was the idea that Jews had to be converted to Christianity in order to attain any level of salvation, and that Judaism had the Christian theology, basically that Judaism has no other purpose after the coming of Christ. So that's a finished deal, and now everything needs to be transferred for the new Israel, basically. So no, I never saw that was a problem for him. But he mentioned it a couple times, that only in passing, and only in the context of the fact that when he was, as a young man, was first invited to go to the student Christian movement gathering, I think, in Edinburgh. And I think William Temple and the deanery, I forget, Campbell, I think, wanted him to go and meet some other people, and he did, and it was fine. But he brought that up later when he wanted to say that he really had never encountered any pressure or push in terms of missions to Jews, and in fact never heard it brought up at these earlier student meetings that he attended. And the reason for that is because it only became a really big issue in 1927, and this was the formative years of organizing and obtaining an international Protestant mandate for this, from like 25 countries, and making all these plans, and they just actually launched it in the fall of 1930, the same time his book was published, which is really fascinating. It's quite funny, too, to think about it. They had no idea what they would be up against.
What would you say Parks' legacy, if there is one, is today within Anglicanism? And did it stretch outside Anglicanism to any of the more non-conformist church structures within?
I think, excuse me, he has an incredible historiographic legacy. For people, as I said, the theologians who are involved in this historiography of the transformation of Christian teachings and attitudes, they all know who he is. But outside of that, I don't think so. Tony would be good to say something here about that, but I don't think so. I don't think he's recognized by his church as a star, and I can't see how he could be.
Well, he's not recognised, but isn't there assumed that everything he argued is now mainstream?
That everything what?
He argued is now...
Well, it is. Well, it is. Yeah, and so yeah. Everything that he did work so diligently for is now considered to be the way it should be, with the exception of some deviations and some movements back to conversionary problems. But as far as the basic teachings and the finishing off of the deicidal guilt charge and some of the other basic tenets of Christian theology, yeah, that's pretty much a done deal. So perhaps is a point that in the new generation he wouldn't even be thought of, because they're growing up thinking, oh, that's the way it's always been. Maybe. I don't think he has any. I don't think he has any recognition that I'm aware of. Well, but there were who was the bishop that wrote the book? The evil. You know.
The evil bishop.
Yes.
After
the evil.
The Bishop of Oxford.
Harris?
Richard Harris.
Yeah. Okay.
I think the causality is problem. It's hard because the Lambeth documents, they're incredibly Parksian, but they don't mention.
They don't mention him.
But there is still some influence, but it's hard to show directly where it is.
Yes.
But without Parks, you wouldn't have got there.
No, they wouldn't have gotten
But
there.
they don't quote him.
No, that he's not. You're right. He's not quoted, but he underlines and undergirds every bit of it, and that's why I feel very comfortable in saying I'm glad we don't have a lot of Christian theologians here to attack me. I don't mean that Catholic theologians who would attack me for the statement I made in the beginning that we have this legacy of everything that he did eventually led to the Nostra Aetate at Vatican II. It's true. He is the one who forged that way, and it was the Catholic theologians that came after him. Now, John Connolly gives him a lot of praise, but he doesn't go that far in his book. He still credits the Catholic theologians for doing that.
Okay. And last question, maybe?
Well, if I may, I'm an Anglican, and I would regard Parks as a hero.
Thank you.
His legacy, for me, is part of the, if I might coin a phrase, a rich outrage by most sections of the modern Church of England and most modern theologians that I can discern, against all forms of prejudice. That there would be a horror against anti-Semitism,
Yes.
but equally against race prejudice or against Islamophobia or something. So
Yes.
I wonder if that very specificness of anti-Semitism, although historically exceptional on account of its barbarism, but nevertheless has become absorbed into a mainstream outrage against all forms of vicious inequality.
I hope so. I mean, if I understand your question, I certainly hope that's the case. May I say something? I don't know if this is on the right train of thought or not, but one of the things that was happening during this period, during this very period, is not that Parks' Christian critics were denying that anti-Semitism was at all problematic. They all believed it to be, and they too were making claims and proclamations against it. But they saw it as strictly and wholly a racial phenomenon, and they refused to look at the Christian elements that had the attitudes and the long history that had created this. And that was where they were so upset with Parks. And that was clear, even whether they were concerned about the conversionary problem or not. They didn't want Christianity to have the past that Parks was continually provoking them to look at. He constantly was provoking, but I don't want to use that even in a vigorous way, because I think he was a very kind person. And one of the things that I am amazed about him is how he listened to whatever people had to say, whether he agreed with it or not. He used it, but I have always been impressed that he didn't deny people their beliefs and the ways in which they wanted to express their arguments. The thing that I think is really important to grasp about him is that he recognized that Christianity had to turn its self-consciousness to the past before it could ever go forward. And so I am constantly, when I'm thinking about Parks, I think of him always, the historian is always looking back, but this incredible humanitarian is always looking forward with hope. So there's this beautiful part to him that I see.
So thank you very much.